So if you're looking for information about, say, Exco, the first person you're going to ask is somebody you know who works at Exco. You're not going to look at the newspaper. You're not going to look at the website. You're going to talk to Joe, who's over at the bar, at the church, or at the tennis club, and you're going to ask him what's going on at Exco these days. And then the employee's kind of in an interesting position because they haven't necessarily been told or officially told by the company what the background is or what the full story is. So there's a huge area of risk if you are not treating your employees as an official channel and at least giving them as much information as you're giving the media. And that's just a recipe for reputational risk for no reason. And the other thing, too, is that every employee these days has the same access to social platforms and networks as anybody else does, inside and outside their industry.
Hello, hello. Welcome to the Internal Marketing Podcast, the unique podcast series where we flip the marketing conversation from external to internal, exploring all the ways that companies can build the brand and drive growth by marketing to their most powerful brand advocates, their very own employees. I'm your host, Kerry-Ann, and I'm very happy to be bringing you this episode where we'll be discussing how you can leverage your employees to be your top external communication channel. But before we get started, it's unnecessarily difficult to make an external marketing tool work for internal communications. The email templates, distribution lists, analytics, tools, and integrations just don't make any sense. Workshop is an internal email platform built exclusively for employee communications, and it gives you a one-stop shop where you can quickly create, send, and measure beautifully branded internal emails and messages. It even automatically syncs with your company's HR data, so you know your lists will always automatically be up to date. Go check out useworkshop.com/marketing to learn more and to see a short demo. And of course, Workshop is the global sponsor of Season 3 of the Internal Marketing Podcast. Thank you, Workshop. I'm happy to have you on board. So let's jump into this conversation with my featured guest, Mike Klein. Mike is a communications consultant and the founder of We Lead Comms, and he'll be sharing why and how you can leverage your employees as your top external communication channel. Okay, well, Mike, thank you so much for joining me here today for another episode of the Internal Marketing Podcast. I know we've been in dialogue about this conversation for quite some time, so I'm very happy that we're finally able to sit down and chat. And I know we're going to get some awesome nuggets from you today. And I'm so humbled that you've taken the time to be a part of this conversation. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you very much. As it happens, I'm just finishing up my COVID isolation in a motel room in Arizona, so the timing couldn't be much better.
Wonderful. Nothing like doing a good podcast interview in isolation. You're certainly not going to get much disturbances going on.
No.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And I'm glad you're not seriously ill and that you're out of the woods and you are just really marking time to be safe and to keep your loved ones safe as well. That's wonderful.
Yes, I will be liberated this afternoon.
Oh, perfect. So our timing is great. So we're going to have this conversation, Mike, and it's great to chat with you because we're going to dig into something that you've been, I call it, preaching about. You can use another nomenclature if you wish, but it's something you've been preaching about for quite some time, and I quite admire it, especially as a marketer, not just for the internal comms folks, because I feel like they would be the choir that we'd be preaching to in this conversation, but certainly as a marketer as well. I just think it's a very, very important discussion to have when we talk about how companies can leverage their employees as their top communication channel. And I know you've been talking about this and writing about this for quite some time. And first of all, I'd just love to level set. Why do you say that employees are a company's most important communication channel?
Well, the best line is that internal is the new external, except it's not so new. It's actually been fundamental to the way that people and organizations have interacted for as long as the modern corporation's been in business. And if you look at any sector except for like the most high-profile business-to-consumer brands, employees are the most likely source of information about their own companies, A. And B, they're visible in their professional and personal communities. So if you're looking for information about, say, Exco, the first person you're going to ask is somebody you know who works at Exco, particularly if you live in Xville, which happens to be the headquarters of Exco. You're not going to look at the newspaper. You're not going to look at the website. You're going to talk to Joe, who's over at the bar, at the church, or at the tennis club, and you're going to ask him what's going on at Exco these days. Now, more directly, salespeople and other kind of representative employees have public roles as organizational advocates. But organizations, really until very recently, have never really seen this as a communication channel. They've seen salespeople as a sales channel, but they've given them the same internal communication, the same thin strand of internal communication they've been giving everyone else. And that's just a recipe for reputational risk for no reason other than perhaps a little bit of organizational simplicity or false economy. The other thing, too, is that every employee these days has the same access to social platforms and networks as anybody else does, inside and outside their industry.
And I think that's such an important point. I mean, a couple of points you're bringing out there, Mike, because ultimately, I don't think companies realize just how powerful their employee voices are. Not only because they're employees and they're part of the company and they know what's happening, but because of the level of trust that those employees have already engendered in their networks outside. I think companies seem to think, okay, once it's coming from the official company channel, people will trust it, they'll believe it. And that's not always the case, right? As you say, if I know Joe,
exactly.
Yeah, Joe is my neighbor, we go to the same place of worship, or our kids go to the same school, I'll faster trust Joe's word on what's happening in the company as opposed to what the company's putting out in the official press release, right?
Particularly if there's obvious omissions in the official press release. The first thing you're going to do is say, I read this from Exco. What aren't they telling us? And then the employee's kind of in an interesting position because they haven't necessarily been told or officially told by the company what the background is or what the full story is. So either they say, I don't know, I can't talk about it, or they make it up, which is at least more likely, or they just simply share their own experience, some of which may be off script. So there's a huge area of risk if you are not treating your employees as an official channel and at least giving them as much information as you're giving the media or you're giving your senior management, because they're as likely to be quoted indirectly or privately as their leaders are to be publicly quoted.
Absolutely. I love that last point. And since we're talking about this, Mike, I'm a why person, right? So I guess my question is, I would have mentioned earlier that maybe the folks in internal comms, they're probably the choir in this conversation. Yeah, we know employees are the most important channel, but if you were to perhaps engage the external communications team, the corp comms and the marketers, I don't think enough of them get how important it is to consider employees as the most important communication channel of a company brand. Do you have any suggestions or perhaps based on your experience, something to offer as to why they don't feel that way or don't believe that that's the case?
I think there's a number of things. I think the biggest reason why the employee audience / channel is treated as an afterthought is because you have marketers and external communications people who either are lazy and don't want to manage it, don't want to handle it, don't want to deal with both the complexity of dealing with X thousand people or X hundred people who are effectively at least semi-autonomous external communication channels, but also because they're not incentivized, they're not measured, they're not managed in a way that they're held accountable for what happens as a result of employee participation in this process, whether it's organized and authorized or not. So that's another part of it. The third part of it is that a lot of external communication and marketing people don't understand the fundamentals of internal communication, which is an alarming trend because there is an equal trend right now in the market of starting to treat internal and external as just communication. You even have like Walmart talking about something called eternal communication, which is actually the repurposing of internal stories for external consumption. But where the problem is that you're often selecting heads of comms and even heads of internal comms who don't understand the fundamentals of internal comms strategy and distribution. They're just basically, their idea is send press releases to employees, for lack of a better term. Send adverts, videos, the same stuff you're sending to customers, send it to employees, and that's going to be what does the trick for you. And if anything, that's counterproductive because it doesn't treat the employee audience with the level of respect that it deserves. The autonomy of the employee as a channel is the most fundamental element of this calculation. And it's not something that a lot of traditional marketers and traditional PR people are trained to deal with.
And I think a lot of it, you alluded to it, a lot of it has to do with how we were even trained. Because I can tell you, going into marketing school, the employee is probably never a part of that training, education, conversation. It's all about the customer. And I mean, I'm not knocking that because it's the customers why we're in business, right? If they don't buy from us, we got a problem. But there's no part of the marketing, learning, and education ecosystem, and perhaps to PR or corp comms, I didn't do any specializations in those, but I suspect it's probably the same thing. There's no part of that education ecosystem that says, hey, if you're trying to reach the customer, it's not just about advertising and PR and social media. There is this channel over here that if you don't pay attention to it, it could likely kill the success of your marketing campaign, right?
Exactly. And there's a couple of places I'd like to go with this. Part of this is because a lot of the training and education that happens in mainstream PR and marketing programs focuses on business to consumer products. In business and to consumer, yes, the role of the employee is less important because the relationship is to a can of cola or to a beer or to an airline seat or to a beach in Montego Bay, for instance. But anything that's business to business is going to be relationship driven. Anything that's truly a service, like even insurance. Most people think about when you ask about your insurance, they're not necessarily thinking about the very occasional payout they get from the insurance company. They think about their insurance agent. So if you're not treating your insurance agent as your primary communication channel, your brand message for your insurance company is going to be either divergent from what your advertising says, or at best, your agent is going to be complying with the messaging rather than exemplifying it. So, and that's in the business to consumer space. Anything that's business to business, you've got a limited number of people in your market, and the relationships are all important. Indeed, one of the things that I've learned in my years of doing internal communication is that the fundamental dynamics of B2B communication really aren't that different from internal comms. It's just you're looking at it from an industry perspective and an ecosystem perspective rather than a simple enterprise.
I'm thinking about somebody who's probably listening to this conversation and saying, look, yeah, it sounds good. They're probably not entirely convinced yet. But I guess my question would be then, for those people, could you kind of share with us, again, from your experience and your own comms journey, what are some of the practical ways that employees can help to strengthen the marketing and corporate communications PR message?
Well, I think you need to take a step back and you have to ask yourself, why would employees want to do it? And that may involve some research, that may involve some rethinking of your own employee or business-wide value proposition. But you've got to look at why I would want to say good things about my company. Well, if I like my job, I might want to keep it. That's one thing. But also at a level above that basic survival piece, there are other things that factor into the equation as well. Does the company share my values? Does the company have admirable goals? Is the company appropriate in the way that it shares its rewards? All of this stuff, all of this feeds into the extent to which employees are going to be willing, particularly, to take the initiative to represent the company appropriately. But that much being said, assuming that you don't have a dysfunctional organization and your people are not out to actively screw you, the steps to take are to make sure they have access to decent quality information that's consistent with your messaging. So not just here's the messaging, repeat the messaging. They need to know why they're opening up a new factory in Colorado and closing one in Florida. They need to know why this is happening and why they want to be part of the storytelling around controversial decisions, as well as telling the benefits of the products and of the organization as a stakeholder and partner. The other thing is making it as easy as possible for them to do it. Having a decent internal communications platform. This isn't optional. You can't just get by with off-the-shelf Slack and Teams anymore. You're going to drive your employees nuts. It's not going to make them enthusiastic about saying what a great place it is to work. I mean, you can keep your Teams, just make sure that it's got a communications tool underneath it so that the right information keeps getting to people where they work. Another thing that's worth looking at is, are you making it part of their jobs? Can you make it part of their jobs? Social recruitment. Social recruitment's a big thing in the war for talent, bearing in mind that the war for talent and the war on talent continues concurrently. But in terms of the war for talent, you can incentivize this either as a requirement or as a bonus for people to do and take part. Another thing you can do is recognize people who are taking initiative and doing the right thing to promote their organization, their communities, and in their market, and tell their stories about how they do it so that people can be more confident about doing it themselves.
Could you share with us some examples of companies who are doing well at this, who would have done a great job of engaging their employees up front in a way that gets everybody aligned, and then you see that play out in how they onboard them and empower them to be able to be that crucial channel that they need to reach their external audience and customers?
Well, I mean, some of the name brand examples that I've heard about, and I haven't worked with them directly, things like Starbucks, Google, KPMG, Salesforce. They do a lot in this area, and they have the systems and infrastructure to back it up. But for example, you don't have to be a big company to do this. I live in Reykjavik, Iceland. And Iceland is about 360,000 people. So there's maybe about a half dozen big companies that have more than, say, 500 employees. And you work for one of these companies. You have a lot of prestige in the community, and people are always asking you what's going on over there. So it's like, I've got a good friend of mine who works for one of the shipping companies. And he's telling me all about what they do in terms of management development, in terms of leadership development, in terms of sustainability. And he's a senior officer in the company, but he has no qualms about sharing this stuff with me. And my image of that company is that it's a legit, responsible company.
I love that example. It's so very, very important because I think even when you talk about some of those brands which folks will be more familiar with, like a Starbucks, right? It's so very evident when you go in because it hits everything. It hits the customer experience. It hits even the communication elements that you see, the journey, and even just how team members are when they engage you. It's like something that's so consistent with the brand values that you not only get it as a customer, but you also remember it, and it makes the experience so unique. You could get a cheaper cup of coffee somewhere else, but there's just something that they've built into the brand that feeds right through to even the very employees who serve you. That just makes it infectious and people want to come back.
Exactly, but there's the other side of it, is that if your engagement with a Starbucks employee outside the shop is dramatically different from your engagement with that employee inside the shop, it blows the whole brand story out of the water. And Starbucks employees, they're not the best paid people in the world. They don't necessarily work the most sociable hours. So if you're not consciously thinking about what that person's going to do, if you're pressurizing the experience inside the shop and it doesn't match up to the reality of being the employee, your credibility goes out the window very quickly, and it can turn into a bit of a spiral. And you're already seeing Starbucks employees starting to vote for unions, which is very antithetical to the Starbucks culture. So part of the challenge with an organization that's trying to produce a really strong brand experience and which isn't driving employee advocacy is you're creating a complete gap. You're potentially creating a gap that can blow up in your face the moment people start talking off the record about what a gulag your company actually is.
Very much so. And I'm glad we're even talking about Starbucks because that's a B2C example straight. So it's not even so much only about how great it works for B2B, but even with B2C, if we had Coca-Cola employees talking about what unsavory practices the company engages in the back when they're mixing the cola, or how they treat their employees, then
Or in the back office, for that matter.
totally. So it lends itself to recognize that for whatever industry you're in, it comes back down to your people and how you're engaging them and empowering them. Going on to the next question, Mike, because again, this is Internal Marketing Podcast, and the heart of internal marketing, it's really about how are we engaging employees and empowering them to be advocates of the brand, to your point. And in that engagement, it's about educating them on not only the products, the services, the mission, the vision, but also the purpose and the why, all right? Practically, again, for folks listening, if we talk about we want to engage employees now to have that translate to advocacy, you started to speak earlier about technology and use of those tools. What are some of the ways that companies can do that kind of engagement in a way that onboards employees to be a part of that voice, that message?
Well, I think the most important thing is organizations need to take into consideration the fact that employees, for lack of a better term, have an on and off switch in terms of being at work. And that yet, while the off switch is on, they're still on. But they feel like they're under less control, or they can be less guarded about what they say and what they think and what they do when they're off the premises, or when they're having lunch with a prospect, or they're at the school talking to the other parents. Companies have to realize that they can't be making 24/7 demands of their employees to do this, but that employees will be doing it 24/7, and you don't want to make it any more difficult on them than it already has to be. So one of the answers that I give to the question, how do you define a company's culture? I define it as the gap between what the company says it's about, what it's actually about, and the amount of pressure that's put on employees to maintain the gap. And the idea is, from an employee advocacy perspective, is you want to keep that gap as small as possible, and you want to keep the pressure on that gap as low as possible. That's the most important thing. And particularly when you're talking about corporate purpose and ESG and even things like diversity, that if your rhetoric does not match your responsiveness, your employees will be the first people to call it out, particularly if they feel that they're in a safe place to do so. So that's the most important thing. Conversely, making sure that employees know that they're free, that you acknowledge their freedom to talk, and that you at most make a request that if they do talk, they should at least be aligned with the reality that the facts that are shared. It's one thing to have employees going off the reservation when you haven't told them what's actually happening. It's another thing when they go off the reservation when you've told them that what's happening, and even if they don't like it. So I guess the key thing is, don't try to force consistency, but try to make it difficult for people to be inconsistent.
Yeah, got that. When you talk about employees as a voice and being part of that external message, I think empowerment is an important word. And I'd love to know, in your view, what are some of the ways that companies, whether it be through the tools or training, is there a way that companies can empower employees to be that external voice, so in a way that's effective?
Yeah, I'd say three things. One, companies need to acknowledge the power that employees already have. That's the most important thing, by far. Don't empower somebody to have power that they already have, because then you get into the area, it becomes tone deaf, it becomes mansplaining, it potentially becomes offensive. So one is acknowledge the power that employees already have. Second, give employees permission to make use of that power. Let them know that you're going to do it anyway, so we're fine with it. And we want to help. We'll talk with you. If you got any questions, talk to us. You can still say, if you're talking to a reporter, have that reporter talk to the press office. That's perfectly legit, because that's an official to official communication. But at a person-to-person level, you can't maintain that kind of control. And if you try to maintain that kind of control, it will blow up in your face, particularly if it's a change from what they're used to. Say a new head of comms comes in and tries to grab hold of everything. Third is recognize that your role as a company is to influence the empowered people you have rather than to control them. really we're in an influence model now. We're out of the control model. And the faster we recognize that, the more effective we're going to be in having the messages that people share privately consistent with those that the companies share publicly.
There's something you said out not too long ago, and I just want to dig into that a little bit, because when you talk about focusing on influencing those people who are already empowered, because, I mean, whether we like it or not, employees, as you rightfully said, are already empowered to speak because they already have their networks and communities and friends and family and colleagues who already respect them. So they do have the power to influence whatever message it is we would love for them to share as a communication channel. But respecting that, as you had said, trying not to control that is important. Are you one of those folks who advocate for companies being aligned and maybe even supporting their employees, building their personal brands? It's a hot button topic in the internal marketing and employee advocacy space, because I think there are some companies who resist that because they're afraid of employees going off script, as opposed to saying, look, we trust you, you're aligned with the values, we respect your empowerment. Go and build your brand because there's a benefit to us as well. What's your view on that?
I think, like the economists say, it depends. And a lot of it depends on what the nature of your business is, what the nature of your ownership structure is, what the nature of your service is, and how you want the overall brand to appear. Let's step out of the corporate world for a second. Let's think about sports teams. The big issue with sports teams is, do you want the stars to be bigger than the team? Sometimes when you're selling merchandise, for example, a team buying Cristiano Ronaldo isn't just buying his ability to deliver goals on the pitch. They're buying his ability to sell T-shirts. They're buying his ability to get fans into the stadium. And so it makes natural sense for Man United to leverage Cristiano Ronaldo's personal brand. Conversely, it makes total sense for Cristiano Ronaldo to have a personal brand, which he takes from team to team. But that's a very outsized example, and it's kind of the exception that proves the rule. If you're professional services, do you want to have personal branding of all of your people be more consistent in terms of the type of person you want your customers to think of you as being? Or do you want to have somebody who's a bit more avant-garde, a bit more rebellious as part of your company who has an existing personal brand? This is something that I'm dealing with on a daily basis because I'm looking at working with organizations. Organizations are looking at working with me. I have an extremely high-profile personal brand in the internal comms industry. That's cool to some people. It's uncool to others. It's not something that I'm going to be able to change. I've got 10 years worth of writing on this subject, scattered in various places around the internet, LinkedIn, articles, books, all of that stuff. Some people would prefer to have an internal comms person who's got 10 years in one company and hasn't written an article in their lives. Because it's also like Wimbledon. Do you want someone who's going to be the player who's smashing the forehands in? Or do you want someone who's going to be the ball boy who's wearing purple and green because it blends into the stadium? I mean, that's a great example of personal brand because it's exactly the distinction between, because personal brand is also personal profile and the extent to which the individual's profile either complements or conflicts with that of the organization. So I wouldn't say every organization should support employee personal branding, nor should I say that personal branding should be fully left to the employee as long as they're part of the organization.
It is an interesting discussion. I'd love to get a sense from you because I have my own experience on this and I'll share it once I hear your response. But who do you think should own the execution of the task of employees being engaged to be part of that external communication channel? Should there be a center of excellence in the organization that does that?
Well, I think it needs to be driven to the extent that it's driven, as opposed to just simply empowered or expected or what have you. The extent it should be driven. It should be driven by whoever's responsible for internal communication, and it should be a core part of what that person does. Now, the actual campaigns or the actual initiatives or the actual subjects, whether it's social recruitment or CSR or diversity or new product launch or people continuing to like their red can cola, should belong with the parts of the business that own that overall piece, but working closely, respectfully, and regeneratively with that internal communications person / engine in the organization. The internal comms person shouldn't take over the marketing of Red Can Cola or industrial sticky stuff.
I find, because of course I'm in marketing, and I find that sometimes the lines get blurred. So I'm in financial services. So some of what we do can be very high touch. So employee engagement is going to be really critical, and it always has been. And what I've found sometimes is that if the lines aren't clear with respect to what are the roles that each side of the coin is going to play, which is a marketing external comm side and the internal comm side, if the lines aren't clearly drawn, then you're going to have a situation where the employees are still kind of just left hanging, to your point. And so I know whenever I'm launching a campaign, by way of an example, there are certain internal communication components that we own and we drive, simply because we started the campaign. So we know what the objectives of the campaign are. We know what we're going after. We understand the role of the employee. So through or certainly with the blessing of the internal communications function, we actually actively engage the team up front, the employee base. There's a nice red carpet launch, or there's a massive Zoom call where we kind of say, hey, here's the big reveal of the new campaign, and this is what it's about, to help people get excited. We do giveaways and promos internally because we want to drive that same energy inside as we do outside to the customer. And internal comms is quite okay with that. And there are some things internal comms does that marketing has nothing to do with, and that's okay too. So I think it's really important to make sure that those lines are drawn clearly and we understand the roles. And I think what you've shared is very valuable there.
Well, I think the key thing to remember about most external communications people and most marketing people is that they don't have an intrinsic understanding of why the internal dynamic within organizations is different from the external dynamic. Even though employees are your most important external comms channel, the process through which they collect, define, discuss, align, and distribute information is profoundly different from any other. Because the boundary of the organization, whether it's the employee or whether you've got contractors, etc., has an effect of creating reverberation, making the messages much more intense, much more personal, much more important than they are to people outside that firewall. And very few external comms people understand the effect of the boundary on the communication itself and the effect of the relationships within the organization. So, for example, you've got a company town, and there's a message. And also the different groups of people within the organization. So say, for instance, in that company town, you've got 1,000 employees. You've got 100 managers. You've got 200 local high school graduates who've been out of high school for no longer than 4 years, for whom it's their first job. You have 50% of those people are Latinx or Hispanic or a dominant ethnic minority in the community. All of those factors are going to have an impact. And also how those groups relate to each other. All of those factors are going to have an impact on how your message is related to the external population. Most external comms people and most marketing people do not factor those dynamics into the role of their employees in representing those views externally. And also the role that each of those factors has for actually generating enthusiasm or leadership, either for or against whatever the messaging is. So you may have a new program, the management may be talking about it as being a great thing. The management's keeping it quiet that it's ultimately going to lead to 100 layoffs locally. There are a lot of moving parts. It isn't just simply the Xco 2000's great, go buy one. Or this is Juan, and Juan's the foreman on the assembly line, and Juan's really proud about the X2000, particularly if the X2000, they're going to start making them locally and in China in 3 months.
Coming down now to our final couple of questions, Mike, what does success look like? I mean, in terms of measurements, I guess there are a lot of us who love to talk about KPIs or ways to, I guess, demonstrate to leadership that employees as an important communication channel is a thing. How is it measured? What does success look like, again, based on your experience?
You need to measure two things simultaneously. And some people only measure one, and it produces completely skewed results. What you need to do is you need to measure the efforts. You need to find the way to make those efforts measurable. Number of conversations, number of shares that show up on social media, number of your hashtags that are showing up. These are things that are measurable, and that they measure the motion, they measure the effort, they measure the intent, and they're valuable from that perspective. They're not the same as measuring the impacts. So when you measure the impact, you really got to look at, okay, what does your work look like on day 0 or day -1 in terms of whether it's the number of widgets you're trying to sell or the number of positive mentions of the X2000 in local or trade media or whatever. You've got to start the day before you launch. And then you track. You baseline, you track. Forget about benchmarking. Focus on baselining. And focus on baselining your performance against agreed criteria. If other criteria come up, if other things start happening, start keeping track of them the moment that you notice. And if you can look backwards, if your systems allow you to look backward to day 0 or day -1 to the extent that you can. And if you're a comms department, start finding a credible way to value the difference so that you can credit to your own bottom line and say, by the way, what we did for employee advocacy on the X2000 was worth 5 times my salary, so give me a bonus, please.
I love that, especially the bonus. Great stuff.
I mean, that's what people in every other discipline do. I mean, communications people are in awe of finance people and operations people. I went to London Business School with these guys. One of my classmates is CFO at Hewlett-Packard right now. He's a great guy. I've got CEOs and stuff like that. What I learned in business school is like sometimes the absolute numbers don't exist, and you've got to come up for the closest you can get. In other words, you learn how to make up some of the numbers. Well, guess what? Our numbers are no less made up than anyone else's. And we need to have enough respect for ourselves to be able to share those.
Absolutely agree. Because that's the language of the business. It's numbers, right?
Right. And because we're not as fluent, we're scared of other people's numbers. Well, guess what? Their numbers aren't any worse or better than the ones we're going to be able to come up with. We just need to know how to come up with them and to share them appropriately.
Absolutely. Well, Mike, this has been a fantastic conversation. I mean, you've shared so many great nuggets today. And as I like to typically wrap my shows with asking all of my guests of all the things you would have shared today with us, Mike, what, in your view, is the key takeaway or the most important nugget that if our listeners were to take one thing away from this conversation, what would that be in your view? What should they take away?
Employees are your most important external communication channel. They're also your most autonomous. Treat them accordingly.
Love that. Word to the wise. Word to the wise. Thank you so much, Mike. So, Mike, again, I'm so grateful for your time and sharing your expertise today. And another question I always ask is, how can we, the internal marketing tribe listening, support you?
Well, I mean, the most important thing would be to hire me to work for you. That would be the most important thing.
Of course.
And if you want to get in touch with me, or actually, best place to get me is on LinkedIn because that's where I basically live. My LinkedIn handle is MKLEIN818. That's MKLEIN818, and you'll find me on LinkedIn. Also, if you are interested in finding out about other communications people who are making a difference in the world, and if you think you are a communications person who's making a difference in your enterprise or community, follow We Lead Comms. That's hashtag WELEADCOMMS on LinkedIn. Follow me on LinkedIn, follow We Lead Comms on LinkedIn. And if you're interested in being featured or profiled, just let us know. I'm easy to find.
Awesome. Yes, and definitely follow him on LinkedIn. And I know that you'll be happy to continue the conversation with anyone who wants to reach out. Absolutely.
Oh, yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Again, I so appreciate your time, your expertise, your generosity of nuggets and sharing. And I'm sure our listeners got quite a bit as well from this conversation. So I'm wishing you all the very best. Continue to stay safe.
Well, I'll do my best. Kerry-Ann, meanwhile, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to connecting with your audience.
Thank you. My pleasure. So all the best to you, Mike. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Internal Marketing Podcast. I hope you got some great takeaways from this conversation. And if you haven't already subscribed to this podcast, then please join the tribe. And don't forget, feel free to share this podcast with anyone whom you believe will find it valuable as well. I'm your host, Kerry-Ann Stimson, and I look forward to your joining me next time.